My name is Bill Stewart, and I'm with the neighborhood group Neighbors Speak Up. And along with Professor David Wachsmuth and our group, we've organized this evening to provide some information about short-term rentals, and particularly look at some of the data that's been gathered on Halifax. I think that'll be interesting. Our group is basically a person-to-person group. We're a volunteer group from the North End. We came together from a local situation of Airbnb and short-term rental in our neighborhood, trying to come to grips with what that means. We had some issues and so on. And as we looked around, we saw there were some other folks in our neighborhood and neighboring streets, and then eventually around the city and beyond that. So we felt we wanted to approach it from a larger perspective, essentially. So we set up a website. We formed a neighborhood committee and began to reach out to people. And one of the important aspects of our work, of course, is that we get a lot of information from people who live in residential areas in the city, in apartments, in condominiums, and so on, as well as from outside of the city, in smaller towns and rural parts of our province. And we also heard from people who also operate tourist accommodation, both small and large. So we've had a lot of input. As I say, a lot of it's person to person. We've tried to share those stories with people, and particularly with the provincial and the HRM Council, because it really will be up to them to put some regulatory framework around the whole area of short-term rentals, no matter what perspective you take on it. As we have worked through the process and looked at the information we had, in many cases, of course, we're asked about, well, what's the data? Can you tell us what the intensity of the problem is and where those issues are and so on? It's a struggle. Some case we've had to borrow information that was relatively current, some less so. One of the points of research for us was Professor David Wachsmuth's work. And some time ago, we actually reached out to David and in hopes that he might be able to come down and visit and share his information with our group, as well as with others who might be interested. And we were happy to learn sometime after that he actually was working on a report on Halifax, which was, of course, very exciting for us because we wanted some information in this whole area. So I hope you're going to enjoy the evening. I think you're going to find it informative. The way we'd like to proceed is that my colleague and neighbor Sharon Batt will be introducing David. We'll then have the presentation, which will be approximately 45 minutes, and then followed by a question and answer session, and perhaps a half an hour or so. Our time limit mainly is the time that we have the room tonight. So we really need to kind of finish things up by 8:30 here. So that's going to kind of govern how we proceed. Anyone who wants to record the event tonight, by all means, go ahead. We'll actually, we're trying to do a video of the presentation tonight. So I think that's about it. Sharon?
Thank you, Bill, and welcome everyone. Welcome to the Halifax Public Library. The library, like our community, is situated on Mi'kmaq, the ancestral unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. And I think this is an important historical and present fact to recognize as we think about Halifax and its future. So I'm so pleased to introduce the speaker tonight. He's an assistant professor at McGill University's School of Urban Planning. Most important for tonight's event, he's an internationally recognized authority on short-term rentals. As an academic, he's written many theoretical papers, but what was exciting to me when I came across his website was a series of detailed analyses of the prevalence and impact of short-term rentals on specific cities: New York, Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal, and Whitehorse. What drew me to these city-specific portraits was the way that they spoke not just to scholars and policymakers, but to citizens trying to understand Airbnb and similar platforms that affect our communities. So these studies are help residents like us think collectively to engage in the policy process in the places that we live. So fortunately for us, as Bill mentioned, Halifax is the latest addition to our guest list of city spotlights. Our speaker grew up in Toronto. He completed university degrees at McGill, University of Toronto, and New York University. There's more information on the handouts on the table. At McGill, he holds a prestigious Canada Research Chair in Urban Governance. I asked him yesterday when we met how he got interested in short-term rentals. Long story short, it involved doing research on gentrification in Panama City, and then realizing that the transformations in housing in Panama had a lot of similarities with what was happening in New York City. So for me, the takeaway to that story was that similar things are happening globally in different communities, which brings me back to Halifax. This is our guest's first visit to Halifax, so please join me in welcoming him to
Well, thank you so much, everybody, for coming here tonight. I have a mic on here. I'm not sure, I think it's on, but regardless, my practice is to speak very loudly. So I hope that won't be an issue. My practice also is to speak fairly quickly because I have a lot I want to talk to you about tonight. I'm very excited to be here. So first of all, I want to say thank you to Neighbors Speak Up for inviting me to Halifax and honestly for launching this project because as Sharon explained, my research team has been investigating the impacts of short-term rentals in cities all around the world, and we've been increasingly motivated to take very deep dives into individual communities after having done a lot of kind of large-scale comparative work. And the easiest way for us to make a decision about where we want to spend some of our time and energy is places where there are folks who are concerned about the issues and are looking to get a kind of empirical basis to have a political conversation. So thanks so much for having me. I also want to just say how excited I am to be here at the Halifax Central Library. One of my other lines of research is about the importance of public libraries to cities and to urban public space. And you've got one of the really great specimens of that here. And I've actually spent a lot of the day here and couldn't be more thrilled to be rounding out the evening. So what I'm going to do is give you a couple of very quick words of introduction. And then I'm going to launch right in. And actually, maybe before I go on to the next slide, I should say that the title for the talk is Short-Term Rentals in Halifax, Politics and Policy. And I've got a colon up there, but really it should probably be a comma, because what I want to do is talk about three things. First, I want to provide a bit of a data dump about the situation of short-term rentals in Halifax, how many there are, what the trends look like, where they're located, what kinds of impacts they're having on housing communities. I then want to talk a little more broadly about some of the political questions which arise, I think, here in Halifax, but in fact, in slightly different ways in communities all around the country and all around the world. And then I'm going to wrap up by trying to lay out some thoughts about what a productive way to think about the policy of short-term rentals would be, particularly what steps we ought to be taking if we want to regulate short-term rentals in the public interest. So at McGill University, I direct the Urban Politics and Governance Research Group, which is a team of researchers trying to understand, trying to investigate pressing urban governance challenges. And particularly, we're interested in challenges that kind of spill out of individual cities' boundaries. And so one of the things we've looked at is some of the challenges around local responses to climate change, because cities are increasingly being understood as leading actors in the fight against climate change on a global scale. But one of the other places that we've been spending a lot of our efforts has been understanding the relationship between forces of globalization and very local housing markets. we usually think of what's happening in a city's housing market as a very local thing. You know, you've got people who want to live in the city, they're trying to find housing. You've got other people who are building the housing that they're going to live in. And you see how supply and demand meet and what the implications of that are. But several years ago, we started tracking the impact of very global sources of demand for local housing in the form of tourist visits and short-term rentals. And we realized very quickly that because tourists have a lot more money they're willing to spend per night than local residents do, if they're in competition for the same housing as local residents, that might be a problematic situation. And what we realized looking around is that there was a lot of public debate about this, a growing amount of public debate about this, and a lot of discussion about what a kind of a responsible approach or response to the emergence of short-term rentals would look like, but not a ton of really good data. And I'm a researcher, I'm an academic, that's kind of where I can come in. And so that's what we've been trying to do over the last several years, is to try to provide a kind of a platform of empirical facts that we can then have a policy conversation about, have a political conversation about, have a conversation about our values. So that's what we're going to do tonight. And the motivation specifically is that as of Tuesday morning, we've launched the latest of our series of reports on short-term rentals in Halifax, which is available to download right now if you want to. It's got a lot of really cool maps and graphs, which I'm going to show you tonight, and a lot more detail besides. So the kind of the empirical material I'm going to be discussing today is coming from this report. So go to the website if you want to check it out. I already explained that the motivation for the project in general comes from the fact that in all sorts of different cities, the emergence of short-term rentals has become, in some places, a political crisis, but almost everywhere the subject of debate about, where you have on one hand neighbors saying our communities are changing and not necessarily for the better because of the emergence of Airbnb and other short-term rental platforms. In other cases, you have property owners saying, well, I've got the property, I want to use it, and you've got visitors saying, I really like being able to stay in residential neighborhoods instead of having to go down where the hotels are. And the research project that we have launched on the basis of this is looking at three things, and these are the three things I'm going to talk about tonight in the Halifax case. So the first of all one is just straight up, what have the housing market impacts been of the emergence of short-term rental platforms? So what impacts have short-term rentals had on housing availability, affordability, and then also quality of life in cities around the world? The second thing we look at are some of the social dynamics which go along with that. So try to understand how the arrival of all sorts of tourists in neighborhoods which maybe hadn't previously hosted them, how that changes those neighborhoods, how it changes living in a condo when you used to have 7 neighbors and now you've got a new set of neighbors every week maybe. And to try to kind of understand, and then also the fact that we have so many more people now are landlords, at least in their spare time, because of the existence of short-term rentals. And then lastly, we're going to talk about policy options. So, I'm a professor in urban planning. We're really policy focused, and I want to make sure we understand what are good options for governments who are looking to regulate short-term rentals. So before I get into all that good stuff, I want to tell you a little bit. Can't see. These next couple slides are probably going to be totally unreadable based on this color choice. I want to talk a little bit about the methodology. Now, if this were an academic talk, this is going to be half the talk. But it's a different crowd, so I'm going to do this very briefly. But I want to give you at least a teaser for why you should trust anything I'm going to say for the next 30 minutes. So first of all, so we have data about every single Airbnb, HomeAway, and VRBO property in the entire world, and what they've been doing every single day since 2015. So that's 15 billion data points, which is, I'm sure you can imagine how big the spreadsheets on my computer are. Because also we get 50 million more every single day. We also have every guest review that anyone has ever left about an Airbnb, about anybody else. It's a huge amount of data, and we've basically spent a lot, you picture Scrooge McDuck swimming through a sea of coins. That's been us with these spreadsheets. We're just kind of swimming through all this data and trying to make sense of it. In particular, because we have this detailed data, we've been able to do a more detailed kind of fine-grained level of analysis than a lot of what is out there. So as an example, this is a map of short-term rental locations in Sydney, Australia, taken from the leading academic journal in urban planning. And it's a nice map in a lot of ways, but there's a problem, which is that every one of these points is just the same as every other one of these points, but in fact, this might be, an entire home rented 350 nights a year, and this is a spare bedroom that was rented once last July and will never be again. There's a lot more, it matters what's happening in the individual locations. Not to mention the fact that there's so much churn in the short-term rental market that half of these are gone the day after you publish the map anyways. So what we do is we take these very detailed sets of information about what every listing looks like, the characteristics, how many bedrooms it has, where it's located, what type of building, that kind of stuff. And then also what those listings are doing every single day. Are they reserved, are they not reserved? And the result is that we can do something a lot more interesting. So does anyone know where that dot is, assuming I haven't screwed it up? Here. That's right here, right? Exactly. Okay. So and then so we've got a 1 kilometer radius of street of the the street grid around our location right now. And what we can do with our data is we can say on a given day where the reservations happened on the short-term rental platform. So the bigger your dot is, the more money that was found on the reservation. The red dots are entire homes. The blue dots are private rooms, and that green dot is actually a hotel. These dots aren't exact because Airbnb shifts location, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. But on top of saying what happened, that was August 1st, we can also say what happened on every single day. And we can see kind of changing patterns of short-term rental activity at a very, very, very fine scale. Now, this is just eye candy, but the idea is that we can use that same level of detail to do some really detailed analyses of what's happening in the short-term rental market and what impacts it's having on local housing. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. The 3 things we've tried to do with our data is to really improve the spatial resolution, to hone in on individual neighborhoods and the impacts there, to use all this detailed daily data we have to get a more accurate picture of the different kinds of short-term rental operations and what makes them different and how they have different impacts. And then also to contribute a set of open source software for other researchers who are interested. So if you happen to be a coder and you want to get in on this, talk to me after the talk, because we've got a lot of tools. Okay, so let's talk about Halifax. What I'm going to do now is provide a quick summary of some of the key points from our report, and then use that as a kind of platform for the rest of the evening. Okay, and I just want to start by just a very kind of quick overview of where short-term rentals are located throughout the HRM. It's a big area. I've got some maps that are a lot more legible than this one. Don't worry. But as a starting point, what I want to say is my microphone fell off. You're hearing my hand in my pocket. Hold on. Is this better? Yeah. Okay. It doesn't have the clip. The clip's here, but the microphone's not on it, so that's my problem. Okay, let's see if this. So that's not really my fault. Okay, let's try this. Let's hope this stays on. So the first thing to note is that the HRM is a big place. The short-term rental activity is very strongly concentrated on the peninsula, particularly in the downtown area, right? And that's a pattern we see in every city we look at. That you've got most of the activity in a very small part of the city. Now, that can lead to the incorrect conclusion that the impacts of short-term rentals are focused very narrowly in that area. That's not true. Housing markets work on a regional scale, and so even though most of the activity is happening in this area, that doesn't mean that the impacts are limited to that area. And this is something we'll get into in a minute. I also want to show you how things have been changing. So this is a comparison of the short-term rental market in Halifax in 2016 and 2019. Again, bigger dots mean more money was being earned. Red dots are entire homes. Green dots are private rooms. What we see, first of all, is that nowadays, almost everything that happens outside of the downtown is an entire home. And you've got a scattering of private rooms in the downtown. They show up more here because they're on top on the map. But the other thing we see is how much growth has happened in the last several years. And particularly how much of that growth has involved spreading of short-term rentals out of the downtown. So I said that that's where most of the activity is, but this is a story that gets less and less true every year. Short-term rentals have been growing and spreading throughout the city. Here's what the overall rate of growth looks like. If you go back, wind back 3 years, there were 500 short-term rentals active in Halifax every day. So this is this is a kind of, if you just go to the Airbnb to HomeAway, type in Halifax, what do you find? It's not saying what's happened to those listings, it's saying how many are on the website. And going back to middle of the year 2016, there were 500. As of August 31st, which is the day we cut off for the study, there were 2,420. And actually, there were more than that. There were 2,420 which were located in somebody's house. Okay, so we also have another 100 or so which are, maybe it's an RV, maybe it's actually a hotel using Airbnb as a platform. We get rid of all those because we want to talk about the impacts of short-term rentals on housing. So all the numbers I'm going to be presenting are for short-term rental listings which are actually located in a home or what could otherwise be a home. So no B&Bs, none of that. Here's how the picture looks if you zoom out to the whole province. So I'm going to be focusing on Halifax, but I want to give a little bit of broader context. And what we're seeing here on the map is the number of active short-term rentals expressed as a percentage of the total number of dwelling units. So the more red you are, the larger percentage of all of the housing in that area is on Airbnb or HomeAway. And the big takeaway here is that there are really 3 zones of strong short-term rental activity in the province. So, I mean, Cape Breton Island obviously pops here as a major tourist destination with not a lot of population. So you've got a ton of activity up there proportionally. And the other 2 are Halifax itself, in particular the peninsula here, and then the South Shore, down to Lunenburg. And actually, as it turns out, on a per capita basis, Lunenburg has the most short-term rentals of any city in Atlantic Canada. Wow. It kind of edges out, it's not really a fair comparison though, because the HRM is so big, right? So you've got all of this, the outlying area with not very much activity, kind of watering down your numbers here. So I don't know, it's not necessarily a good thing to be winning this race. But basically, the South Shore, Halifax, and Cape Breton are kind of the 3 pockets of activity, whereas the rest of the province, not so much happening. If we narrow in now on what these listings look like, what's actually, what kinds of activities are they hosting? First thing to note is that overwhelmingly, short-term rentals in Halifax are entire homes. Okay, you can list an entire home, a private room, or even a shared room where you've got a kind of 4 beds, a bunk bed kind of situation. And also hotels can list hotel rooms. But as it turns out, in Halifax, 3/4 of all the listings which are active on any given day are for the entire home. And those generate 90% of all the revenue. Now, part of that's because they charge more money, right? But it's also because that's just where the action is. So it's a very reasonable approximation to say the short-term rental market in Halifax is entire homes. Okay, but on top of that, we can also look at how it breaks down by the size of the unit. And particularly here, what we're interested in is how many of the homes that are being rented on short-term rental platforms are family appropriate? Are the kinds of houses, homes that could be housing a whole family? If you think about that as 2 bedrooms or more, what you see is that more than 60% of the entire home short-term rentals in Halifax are in units that have 2 or more bedrooms, so they're suitable for families. These numbers are, I would say, quite atypical for Canada. It's much more common, particularly in the biggest cities, to see a lot of the short-term rental market in studio and 1-bedroom apartments, in condos. In Halifax, you've got actually most of the short-term rental stock is in bigger homes that are actually very suitable for larger families, although those aren't necessarily moving here anymore. One thing that we're interested in when we're trying to understand patterns of activity is who the hosts are, right? Because what I've been talking about so far is if you look listing by listing, but some people who operate short-term rentals have 1 spare bedroom that they rent from time to time, and some people have 100 whole apartments that they're renting non-stop, right? So there are different ways we can slice this up. But one way we can do it is we can look at who earns the money on short-term rental platforms. Now, hosts in Halifax earned more than $30 million last year, so it's a lot of money is flowing through these platforms. But as it turns out, that money's flowing into a very small number of pockets. Just 5% of the slightly under 1,980 hosts in Halifax, just 5% of them earned more than 40% of all the money on the platform last year. Whereas the other, and just 10% earned a very strong majority of all the money. In other words, you've got a very large set of people who've got a spare bedroom that they rent once in a while. Or they go out of town for the weekend and they rent their place while they're gone. That's called home sharing, right? There are lots of those folks. But they're an increasingly small part of the short-term rental market in Halifax. Instead, most of the activity is being generated and most of the money is being earned by a very small number of folks who, in many cases, operate multiple listings and they operate them throughout the year. And not only is this true right now, but it's also true that this is a trend that has been increasing very steadily. So what we're looking at here is the share of the total number of listings and the share of all the revenue generated by commercial operators. And we're using a very conservative definition of commercial operators here. We're saying any host that operates more than 1 entire home listing. So they can't possibly be living in both of them, right? Unless there's some kind of very complex family arrangement. And we also look at hosts who have a whole bunch of private room listings, 3 or more. It could be that they got a 4-bedroom house and they live in 1 bedroom. That's not a very common arrangement. So if you look at the hosts who have 2 or more entire homes or 3 or more private rooms and see how much of the market they account for, and then also trust that they're all telling the truth and they're not splitting up their listings between multiple accounts, which actually turns out to be pretty common. So in other words, these are the lowest possible estimates of this issue. What we see is that right now, more than 40% of all the listings and a majority of all the revenue in Halifax is being generated by these commercial operators who have multiple listings. And on top of that, look, I want to just draw attention to how much this has changed over time. If you go back to the end of, the middle of 2016, that number is more like 20%. In other words, the share of short-term rental listings in Halifax, which are commercial operations, by this conservative count, has doubled in the last couple of years. It's also worth saying that this is not a trend line that looks like it's flattening out particularly. In other words, if the market just evolves on its own, what we are going to expect to see is an increasingly large share of the market operated by an increasingly small set of folks. And I'm going to come back in a little while to what the implications of that story are in terms of thinking about the balance between home sharing and commercial short-term rentals. So I've got some more numbers and some maps that I'm going to show, but I'm going to kind of weave them in a little bit because I want to get into some of the kind of what I think of as the big themes of the relationship between short-term rentals and cities. And I want to start by talking a little bit about the housing impacts. Okay? The question here really is, how do short-term rentals interact with housing availability and affordability? And it's a tough question to answer really, to like 5 decimal places because of data questions, but it's not a very tough question to answer in the aggregate. And so what I want to start with is the basic story. The basic story, which I wrote it up so we can all read it together, is that most short-term rentals are operated out of housing, right? So again, in Halifax, you've got about 2,580, I believe, total short-term rentals on a given day, and 2,420 of those are in housing. So we kind of leave aside the ones that are just B&Bs or hotels. So most short-term rentals are operating out of housing, and if they're full-time, then they're taking housing off the market, right? Either because there used to be somebody living there, or because there could be somebody living there. A new condo that gets built and it turns into a short-term rental instead of an owner-occupied or renter-occupied condo. Maybe there was no one living there before, but that could be somebody's home. So that's one half of the story. And then if the short-term rental is part-time, you've still got somebody living in that house, but you're actually still increasing housing prices and rents to a lesser extent because they're increasing the economic value of the housing. And the idea here is, if you think about it, if you're on the housing market looking to buy a home and there's a home that comes up that has a basement suite, or say kind of one more bedroom than you need, you may not be interested in operating that as a short-term rental, but somebody will be. And so when you're competing, bidding on that house, you're bidding against other people who can factor in the income from the short-term rental. So what it means is that in general, the existence of short-term rentals drives up housing prices and drives up rents. And that's true even about the part-time stuff, although most of the impacts, the stronger impacts, come from the full-time housing. I also want to point out that there is an exception if the housing isn't really housing, right? So a bed and breakfast that's been operated in the same location for 50 years, that's not going back to the long-term housing market. We do our best to exclude those. And that would also be the case for long-time vacation rentals, which are not going to be super common within the city necessarily, but certainly elsewhere in the province you're going to see more of that activity. Now, one of the things to think through the housing impacts of short-term rentals is to think about who the winners and losers are, right? Because we've got some of each. And it's pretty clear what that story looks like. The winners of short-term rentals from a housing perspective. So, because of course, there's also the winners. If when you're visiting, you get to stay in one. That's nice. Presumably that's part of the story. But from a housing perspective, the operators of short-term rentals are the ones who benefit, right? So home sharers, they earn a little bit of side income to pay the mortgage or the rent. That's good. And commercial operators are operating short-term rentals because they feel like they're going to earn more money from that than they would if they had a long-term tenant. So that's where the benefits come in. In exchange for that, the costs are that everybody pays more for housing. Now, this can be a hard thing to sort through because the benefits can be very narrowly concentrated and the costs are very diffusely spread. In other words, we see short-term rental operators who are making 3 or 4 times as much from running an Airbnb as they would if they had a long-term tenant. They have a really strong stake in the situation. But the housing, the impacts on housing availability and affordability are very, very spread out. And importantly, they're not just limited to the neighborhood where the short-term rentals are occurring, because housing markets work on a regional scale. If you can't find an apartment that you were trying to find downtown, well, maybe you look in the North End, and if you can't find a house in the North End, maybe you look somewhere further afield, right? So you get rippling impacts. There's really strong empirical data on this from the United States, which suggests that a 1% increase in just total number of Airbnb listings leads to a 0.01% increase, 0.018% increase in rents, which doesn't seem like a very large number, but there's been a 300% increase in Airbnb listings here in the last couple of years, right? So you start adding those up, and you actually end up with much higher numbers. In fact, this study found that 1/5 of the total amount of rent increase year to year in the United States can be attributed to short-term rentals in the United States. And keep in mind, there are many places in the U.S. that have very little of this activity, right? So the places that have it have a lot of it. What we've tried to do is we've tried to use our knowledge of what's happening day to day in properties to identify the properties which are very likely to be full-time short-term rentals that don't have anybody living in them, okay? So the way that we do this is we look for properties which are available for rent for a majority of the year. And then we also make sure that we're finding properties that are booked with kind of at least a 50% occupancy rate on that. So at least 90 nights of the year they're booked. And what we find when we look for these, what we call frequently rented entire home listings, is that they are growing very fast in Halifax. So this is our best guess for how many housing units in the HRM are operating right now as full-time short-term rentals and how that's changed over time. Currently, we believe there are 740. That was as of August 31st, so it's probably 760 by now. Most of these are entire homes. Some of them are clusters of private rooms operating out of whole apartment buildings, which I'm going to talk a little bit about later because there's kind of a fun story there. One thing I want to point out is that this trend, right? Actually, the housing units operating as full-time short-term rentals are growing at twice the speed of the rest of the short-term rental market in Halifax, okay? So the total number of short-term rentals, Airbnbs, increased by 20% last year, but this stuff increased by 40%. So there's been a 40% increase in 1 year in the number of housing units which have been lost to full-time short-term rental operations in Halifax. If we look at how they're distributed throughout the HRM, we again see that there's a really strong concentration here, particularly when you look at it relative to the supply of housing. So this map is showing the percentage of housing units in each area that's been converted to full-time short-term rentals. And what we see is around where we are here, we've got 1%, 1.5%, more than 2% in some cases of all the housing is now a full-time short-term rental in some of these areas. Now, 1%, I don't know, that may seem like a small number to you, but the rental vacancy rate in Halifax is 1.6% right now. And that's the rate that really determines the kind of success that somebody has if they're looking for a place to live, right? Because if you're looking for a new apartment, you don't care what's happening in the 98.4% of apartments that have somebody living in them, right? What you need to know about are there apartments available for rent right now? So it's that rental vacancy rate that does the work in terms of establishing how favorable the conditions are for housing in a city. And these are parts of the city where there are many more short-term rentals operating full-time than there are apartments available for rent at any given moment. In fact, as many as twice as many. And what we can do with that knowledge is we can project what would happen if we turned those full-time short-term rentals into long-term housing. What would happen to the rental vacancy rate? Now I said it's 1.6% across the city of Halifax. By the way, a healthy vacancy rate is like 3 to 5%. When you're under 2%, that's big trouble. In fact, downtown, the vacancy rate is 1%, 1.2%. It's very low. Because downtown is where the short-term rentals, the commercial short-term rentals are concentrated, we could actually triple that vacancy rate in the short term if we put those units back on the market. Now, if you put them back on the market, it's not like the vacancy rate is going to stay tripled, because what's going to happen is people are going to start living in those apartments, and the vacancy rate is going to come down. But what's going to happen is rents are going to come down too, because there are going to be more apartments available, and we'll settle at a new equilibrium, and maybe the vacancy rate will be 1.9 instead of 1.6, and the rents will be a little bit lower than they otherwise would have been. But there's a major contribution, particularly down here, that short-term rentals could be making to the supply of housing in the city. The bottom line is that the housing loss from short-term rentals is narrowly concentrated in Halifax, in the downtown area. But the effects ripple out into the housing market, and that's the kind of the key idea that we should be thinking about from a regulatory perspective. So now what I want to do is actually contextualize some of that information about housing loss by thinking about some of the kind of larger questions about the social dynamics around short-term rentals, tourist staying in residential neighborhoods, and the like. And I think one way to think about this is that the good and bad about short-term rentals is it's kind of two sides of the same coin, right? Which is that strangers are staying in our homes. And that can be a really nice thing, certainly for the visitor, but also potentially for the community, but it has its problems. And the questions about how the positives and the negatives there are balanced. So on the one hand, as a tourist, it's really fun to stay in the part of the city that you wouldn't have otherwise been able to stay in because there aren't hotels there. You get new kinds of social encounters. But it means from the residents' perspective, you've got a much more kind of transient population passing through, which can undermine kind of feelings in the neighborhood. On the one hand, as a traveler, it's more convenient for families. I've got 2 little kids, and let me tell you, we squish not very politely into a small hotel room these days. But it's also more convenient for parties, right? That Airbnbs are really great locations to rent to throw a big party, and that's a big source of nuisance complaints. Issues around garbage, there have been some really terrible incidents of violence in the United States in short-term rentals. On the financial side, operating a short-term rental can provide extra money to pay the mortgage or pay the rent. But it also is the case that the existence of short-term rentals means you need more money to pay the mortgage or pay the rent, because short-term rentals are driving up housing costs. So this is the kind of good and bad. Something, and a lot of these questions boil down, they're moral questions, they're political questions, they're questions for kind of a public debate. One place that we are trying to make a contribution is to try to understand systematically what actually fuels the complaints that we see. And particularly what we've been trying to answer with some research that hasn't been published yet, but I'm going to give you the sneak preview, is what predicts positive or negative sentiment within a neighborhood towards short-term rentals. We've got this really crazy project where we've looked at every single newspaper article that mentions short-term rentals. We mine the text to see if the coverage is positive or negative. We geolocate it to all sorts of different neighborhoods, and we do this across dozens of cities. It's been quite a slog, I will tell you. But what we have been able to come up with is a pretty strong account of when neighborhoods are positively inclined towards short-term rentals and when they're negatively inclined. And what we have found is that something that does not predict whether or not a neighborhood will feel positively or negatively towards short-term rentals is the amount of short-term rental activity in the neighborhood, okay? So this is the first point, that there's no inherent bias against short-term rentals in neighborhoods. Instead, overwhelmingly, the thing that predicts when neighborhoods will have negative sentiment towards short-term rentals is housing vulnerability, okay? In particular, neighborhoods that have high numbers of full-time commercial short-term rentals are going to be negatively disposed. Neighborhoods that have unaffordable housing, when you compare the cost of housing to local incomes, are going to be negatively disposed. Neighborhoods with high numbers of renters who are more vulnerable in the housing market because they can be evicted, and because they don't have, they tend to be lower income, they are also more negatively disposed. And then also neighborhoods with high numbers of newcomers. In other words, neighborhoods where there's a lot of churn in the population. So not newcomers as in immigrants, as in people moving into the neighborhood. In all these situations, we basically track onto situations where the housing situation is uncertain. This is what predicts when neighborhoods will have a negative disposition towards short-term rentals. In other words, this is not a story about wealthy homeowners kind of acting out of NIMBY concerns to guard themselves. Instead, it's a story about people reacting to disruptions to their communities, disruptions to their neighborhoods, and particularly disruptions to their ability to afford the rent or afford the mortgage. This is just some eye candy. This is a map from this work in Montreal where we've tracked how much housing need there is in a given area of the city and how much negative sentiment there is. And what we see is kind of basically a pretty strong relationship where the areas with a lot of housing need are also the areas that are unfavorably disposed towards short-term rentals. But then we also see some kind of outliers, like why at the East in particular they really hate Airbnb, but actually everybody can afford the house. So these are issues for us to explore in more detail. But the broad story is very clear from this research where we looked at over a dozen cities across North America, which is that communities don't object to short-term rentals per se. They object to short-term rentals making their housing situation worse. Okay? So last thing I want to talk about here is a little bit about the policy side of this. Because increasingly a lot of my time is spent having these kinds of conversations. Because I think that there was a period of time when we weren't sure what was happening with short-term rentals. They were growing, but we didn't really know if they were going to be an issue that needed regulating. And I think now it's pretty clear that they do. But there still are a lot of questions about how cities should be regulating short-term rentals. These are the kinds of questions that I have a lot of discussions about these days. And in response to almost all of them, I will always pose a question of my own, which is the question of the data. Where is it? And I want to give you an example of how this works and kind of talk to you about why this is going to be the key thing about how we're going to regulate short-term rentals here in Halifax. So this is an Airbnb listing in New York City, where I lived for a long time. I guess I was in London when I took this screenshot, so it says entire flat. It's an entire home apartment, right? Steps away from Central Park, very nice. Now, as it turns out, all entire home Airbnbs are illegal in New York City, 100% of them. So this is an illegal short-term rental. We know, right? If it says that it's illegal. So if you're the New York City government, you might be interested in knowing who is Lily. You might be interested in knowing what's going on in her calendar, because there sure are very few available dates. Is she booking all these dates? Or is she maybe actually mostly just blocking her calendar off and it's only available the date she's out of town or something like that? You might also be interested to know where she's located. You'd really want to know that one if you want to send her a tax bill or something. But you don't get to know that, right? And you don't get to know that, but they don't get to know that either. The city of New York, they don't have any magic wand that gives them this information. In fact, for users of the platform and also for governments, hosts are anonymous, the calendars are hidden, and the locations are obfuscated. Which means that fundamentally, there's no easy way for any kinds of regulations to be enforced in this context. What that means is that a whole set of, I think, reasonable approaches to regulating short-term rentals in response to local concerns, which vary a lot from place to place, right? All boil down to, can you get the data? So the most important constraint, in other words, on local regulation of short-term rentals is the lack of data. And just to give you my personal anecdote about this, I got a call a couple years ago from Halifax, Quebec, the tax folks, and that's not a call you like getting. And I'm trying to think, oh God, what did I screw up? But actually, it was the person in charge of short-term rental enforcement for the province of Quebec, and he wanted to know if I could help them track down short-term rental hosts who were violating the laws. And I said, well, I guess, but isn't that your job? What do you do? And he explained that when they get a complaint, what they do is they go airbnb.ca/ and then they go to the button that says make a reservation, and they click it, and they spend $200 taxpayer dollars to make the reservation. 24 hours later, they'll get an email from Airbnb saying, we look forward to your upcoming stay, here's the address. Now they have an address, so now they can figure out who owns the place, they can get in touch with them and start talking about the rules. Now there are 100,000+ short-term rentals in Quebec. That's not really a system that scales very well. So this has turned out to be a big deal. But I want to, and I think that's kind of feel easy to understand that if you don't have the information, you don't know what's going on. But I want to give two, fun. I mean, not fun. I think they're fun. They're fun for me for the kind of work I do. Examples of some of the kind of, I think, more surprising dimensions of what the lack of data means for our understanding or lack of understanding of the policy story of short-term rentals. So the first example, it was Halloween a couple weeks ago, so I've still got a kind of Halloween hangover here, is about what we call ghost hostels. So this is going to be very spooky. There's a ghost story here. The idea here is that a lot of efforts to regulate short-term rentals are focused on the entire home listings, because I think it's pretty clear, first of all, that's most of them, right? But also that it's kind of obvious that a full-time entire home listing's got to be taking housing away from somebody, right? It's not, nobody's living there. By contrast, the private room listings, which are not super common here in Halifax, but they're more common in different places, have mostly kind of slid under the radar as not a big concern. So what I want to show you is 6 really nice private room listings in Williamsburg in New York, all very tasteful places that you can stay. Now I want to show you the 6 living rooms of these 6 nice private room listings. Yeah, amazing. Wow. In fact, this is an example of what we call a ghost hostel, which is a cluster of private room listings operated out of one apartment. Often these are made to look like you're renting a spare bedroom, but actually the entire building has been turned into these spare bedrooms. So here's a review from one of these ghost hostels that says this is made to look like a couple sharing their home on Airbnb, but it's actually more like a hostel run by multiple people. There are like 20-ish tiny rooms. You can hear people snoring. But then here's the thing, for those who believe every small room is private, it's actually not. On my check-in, I was given room keys for room 116, but my room was 115, but my key still worked for room 115. The door key to every single room is the same. That sounds bad, but let me tell you, it's better than the alternative. Because if every door key actually did only open its own door, and somebody is asleep when there's a fire, there's nobody living in this building who operates the short-term rental. So that person is not going to, it's going to have a very hard time getting out of that alive. So there's very serious health and safety concerns here. I will tell you as well, I made a presentation on this to the enforcement folks in New York a while back. And a week or two later, I got a phone call saying, you'll never believe it, we just busted this place. And it was a coincidence. They got some health and safety complaints. They went to investigate. They shut it down. And the guy said, I was looking at the photos. I said, wait a minute, I've seen this before. So RIP, this particular ghost hostel. So how do we find these, right? So I'm going to tell you about how many there are, but how do we find them? Well, what we do is it's kind of interesting work. These are all the private room short-term rentals in a chunk of Midtown Manhattan. And we know who operates each of them. We know the host accounts, right? Now, what we can do is we can look at clusters of rooms which are pretty close to each other, operated by the same host. And it's possible that one host is managing your spare bedroom and your spare bedroom and your spare bedroom. It's not really that likely, though. What's much more likely is that the fact that Airbnb shifts the locations of listings to protect privacy means that they're actually all located in the same building, and Airbnb just shifted the points. Well, we can actually check for this because we've reverse engineered the way Airbnb hides the location of listings, and we can see if in these cases, is there a spot that all these private rooms could have come from? And in fact, in this case, we find that there are. And in just this little couple blocks, what we actually found was 150 private room listings, which seem to be a spare bedroom, but actually are 35 ghost hostels operating in this section of Midtown. We looked at this in 9 cities initially across the world, and made some cool maps and made some cool tables, which I won't bore you with. But I will tell you that in general, we found a pattern where cities with more housing affordability problems had more of these ghost hostels. So Singapore's kind of in a world of its own, but broadly speaking, we had 4 cases of very expensive cities, which all had higher and rising proportions of their private room short-term rental markets in ghost hostels. And then a set of cities which are, relatively speaking, much more affordable, and they didn't have so much of this activity, which was a kind of an interesting thing. We also found, download the paper if you want to make it through this table, but that in general, ghost hostels are located further out from the city center and from the tourism areas, and they charge less per night. So in other words, these are a budget-conscious option, right? If you don't mind staying a bit further out, you want to pay a little bit less, but they actually earn more money. Because if you take one entire apartment that you could rent for $100 a night and split into 3 rooms for $50 a night, you're making more money, right? This doesn't work in every case, but this is basically the pattern that we found. And by the way, you've got 197 private room listings here in Halifax that are active today, which actually are 48 ghost hostels. Okay, so these are the locations of 48 of these buildings, which seem like they are about 200 spare bedrooms, and they're not. So that's anecdote number 1. Just to stress the point here, as far as I'm aware, nobody knew about any of this, right? And so we got a tip about this in New York, and we looked into it, and we found that this is common throughout the world, actually. But for the most part, regulators just haven't, for good reason, they just haven't known that this is a part of the short-term rental market they need to be thinking about. And a part, by the way, that has really rampant health and safety issues in particular, right? I want to tell you one other very quick story, and then I'll be done, which is asking the question of if we actually know what we think we know about regulations working or not working. And I'm thinking here about San Francisco, which was one of the first cities to really crack down in a visible way on short-term rentals. They were motivated by really serious housing affordability problems there. And so what they want to do is they want to restrict commercial operators and get that housing back on the market. The way they did that was mandatory registration, which I think is in general a good idea. And the result of this was widely described as about half of the short-term rentals vanished. Half the Airbnbs vanished in San Francisco. And that's true. I mean, if we look at it from our numbers, we found that the active data listings dropped by 42% in San Francisco. So that seems like a big victory. But the thing about this is that this is purely going off of how many listings are active on the website on a given day, which doesn't tell you very much about what's happening in the listings that are active, right? And if you look at those numbers, which we have, a different story emerges. So first of all, what we found is that the revenue being earned dropped, not in absolute terms, it dropped about 15% from what we think it should have been at. So we compared New York and San Francisco, which were growing at basically the same rate. We see what happened in New York, no regulations. So we see what San Francisco should have had happen. The revenue dropped. It dropped quite a bit, but it didn't drop nearly as much as the listings dropped. But the other thing we can do is we actually went and tracked down all the listings that were kicked off the system, because we can see every day which listings vanish. We scrape these things every day. And we saw 2 periods where all the listings were taken down, right? So we can say, okay, well, let's look into those listings. And what we found overwhelmingly is that the listings that were taken down were dead. They were listings that had been used a couple years ago and no one had bothered taking them off the website. But when there's a mandatory registration, you got to pay $50, they just said forget it. What that means is that if you look at the kind of before and after situation, After the regulations kicked in, there was actually more, proportionally, of the short-term rental activity in San Francisco was the long-term, full-year stuff. All the dead weight had been kicked off the platform. The commercial operators, they all registered. And what happened is the city of San Francisco thought that they were doing a really good job because they saw these listings disappear and didn't put the effort into enforcing the rules to make sure that everybody signing up was telling the truth about if this is really my home or not, because they saw the 50% decline. In fact, we found that commercial operators are now a dramatically larger share of the San Francisco market because the little guys disappeared. Again, mostly just dead listings, and were replaced by commercial operators. So is this a success or a failure? It really depends on your perspective on this. But the idea is that this story is not known. And in fact, short-term rental policy is being set in general in the absence of really good data. And sometimes actually with potentially data-driven empirical understandings, which are actually just not true. Which I think poses a real challenge for how we do this right. And frankly, the kind of thing that we're trying to help out with. So I'm going to conclude now with just a couple of kind of takeaway thoughts. The first one is just to summarize a kind of big point of the presentation, which is that housing vulnerability is the thing which drives concern about short-term rentals. Okay, so that's a robust finding across many, many different cities. I think that that's true here in Halifax as well. I also want to suggest that thinking that through and thinking about the kind of broader patterns of activity that we've looked at, we think that a really promising path forward to start thinking about regulation is mandatory host registration. What this means is get everybody in your system, and particularly ask them if you live there or not. So make a distinction between people who live and are operating as home sharers versus people who are operating commercial, short-term rentals, basically running hotels. And then we can decide what to do about that going forward, but no matter what you choose, you're never going to get there unless you can figure out who's who. That's just kind of the data problem, right? And the easiest way, I think probably the only way, frankly, to solve that in any real way is by registering all your hosts. Lastly, if the housing concerns kind of win the day in the political fight, then it's pretty clear to me that the low-hanging fruit here is restricting commercial operators. It used to be the case in Halifax that most of the Airbnb activity was people sharing their homes on a part-time basis. Now it's the case that most of the short-term rental market is commercial operators running hotels out of what used to be people's homes. There's no reason why we couldn't go back to that previous model, where people actually are helping to pay the rent. So it's it's not a choice in the sense of nobody said, let's make it this way, but it's a choice by default because there hasn't been any action taken to change the situation. But I see no reason why you couldn't have a thriving short-term rental market that's focused on home sharing as opposed to the commercial operators. And it's very clear that that would get, in the case of Halifax, something like 700 plus housing units back on the long-term rental market. I think that's worth taking seriously. So with that, I want to say thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to some questions.
Right now in this province, there hasn't been an affordable housing program for 50 years.
Yes.
50 years. You've taken you're taking it away from the little guy. He can't afford a house anymore. Okay? That's why basically what you're doing, you're putting everybody into apartments. Now isn't that wonderful? That's great. But people have to live, and they have to be able to live, and they can't live, they're paying $1,500, $1,700 a month. They could own their own home if the government would get off their rear end and do something about it. Now they gave me a deal here, I got a deal from CMHC, they sent me their new housing project. The date was, the example they gave me was a $400,000 house. 5% down, that's $20,000, and they were gonna invest in this $10,000 program they're talking about. They take the $10,000, instead of reducing the down payment, they apply that with the $20,000 to make $30,000 down payment, and the benefit to the homeowner, they're going to reduce the monthly payments from $2,900 a month to $2,700 a month.
So what's the short-term rental angle on that?
What's my angle on that?
Well, I'm just wondering what the question is related to short-term rentals in Halifax.
Well, you're basically what you're looking at your article. All you're really doing is transferring the money from the little guy to the bigger guy.
Right. Yeah, I think that's exactly what we're seeing here too. Thank you. Yeah.
I was wondering, are the hotels and motels making cause with the renter? Because isn't it affecting their bottom line?
Yeah, it is. I mean, this is a complicated question. I think that, you know, honestly, the research on this is kind of mixed. I mean, I think the hotels are concerned, clearly. I think, you know, different parts of that market are affected to different degrees. Luxury hotels are not, I think, on the whole, are not seeing a big hit. The motels, at the lower end, I think it's a big story there. You know, I don't know personally, but my sense is that their concerns are about the financial side of things. You know, short-term rentals, in a lot of cases, are paying residential property tax rates, which are much lower than the commercial rates. They're usually not paying whatever hotel tax is charged on the hotels. So I think it's kind of common sense that those things, there should be a level playing field there. And that's what the hotels have been focused on, I think, for the most part. I think that that's very reasonable. You know, I think that what happens in politics is you get, you know, an issue and you get people lined up on both sides. So I think it's kind of natural that the renters and the hotels are kind of on the same side of the issue, but I think ultimately are kind of looking at different dimensions of it, which I think is reasonable.
David?
What about apartment buildings? I stayed in an Airbnb in Ohio where there were 8 apartments.
Yeah.
And one of them was an Airbnb.
Right. Yeah, so, okay, so it's not in the report, but because someone was asking me about this yesterday, I did a little number crunching on this from my hotel room this morning. So apartment buildings are way overrepresented in the short-term, among short-term rentals. You know, if you compare the amount of Halifax housing that's apartments to the amount of short-term rentals that's apartments, a lot more of the apartments are on short-term rental platforms. It's also true that the full-time stuff, the apartments are even more overrepresented. Something that we know from research on this in the States is that the base, if you describe the risk of a given housing unit converting to a short-term rental, the risk is way higher with renter-occupied housing. And the reason for that is just obvious, right? It's like if a tenant leaves, you can convert it or you can just kick the tenant out. Whereas if it's owner-occupied, someone's got to move out and sell the house. Like it's, so what we see is that there's a lot of vulnerability for renter-occupied housing converting to short-term rentals. Some of that's apartments, some of that's condos that used to be renter-occupied. And the piecemeal thing you're describing is exactly the pattern that we have been observing as well. Where a landlord, I think typically what would happen is does some renovations. And the renovations are finished and they've got 4 units. And you know, maybe they find a tenant quickly, but maybe they actually, let's just try Airbnb for a little while. And you end up with a situation where 2 are Airbnb and 2 are not. And it's a, you know, it's a problematic situation because the building changes and, you know, kind of one by one the units are converted. Okay, I don't know how to do this.
I find that that's an issue, you know, in downtown Bath, which is right across, and that's one of the density areas.
Yeah.
And we've been there a long, long time. But I came across one by accident where we have an apartment building on the street, and they actually do 3-month rental, 6-month rental.
Yeah.
If people come into town and they have to go to hospital,
Yeah.
they can rent out for a month. You know, so they've been doing this for a long period of time. And then this summer, I suddenly discover, I'm looking at it and thinking, what the heck? That's the same building, because my friend used it when she was leaving our house and staying until she transferred somewhere else.
Yeah.
They're doing Airbnb in about 3 of those units.
Yeah.
So that kind of even takes it off the market for other people, you know, that might come into town, go to hospital, they're here to work for 3 months and leave something for 3 months, because they're only bachelor units.
Right.
But they've been refurbished, and since
And are
they've
suitable
been
for
refurbished,
visitors.
that's when, and somebody else is doing it for them,
Yeah.
and that was just pure accident that we came across it.
Yeah, and I mean, you're raising a couple points here. One of is that, you know, the platforms are just platforms, right? In the sense that you can use Airbnb for long-term rentals if you want, you know, set a 12-month minimum or something, right? It's not impossible. And actually some of these kinds of longer-term, short-term rentals, they're moving to Airbnb and HomeAway just because they're good platforms for doing the transactions. But I think you do kind of open up, like there's a kind of Pandora's box here where once you're on that platform, you start getting the messages from Airbnb saying, hey, you know, we noticed you could adjust your price like this and shrink the stay length, and soon enough you're just running an Airbnb. So that's an issue. The point about the people doing it for them, this is one of the issues that becomes quite challenging is that, and again, it explains part of the story about home sharing kind of losing out to the commercial operators, is that one of the things we track is what the average response time is when you make an inquiry to a short-term rental operator, like how long it takes to get back. And there are many properties where the average response time is 2 seconds or less. You know, I'm on my phone a lot, but I'm not on my phone that much, right? What's happening is that they've got services that have bots that will do the response, and then of course they've also got services that will do the key management and the cleaning and all that kind of stuff. Which means that they have the logic of like in economic terms, where they are really motivated to achieve large scale. Where they have all these costs which don't increase as quickly as their ability to make money if they can book, okay, we did 200 nights last year, let's get 300 this year, let's get 360 next year, you know? So the presence of these intermediaries, these other firms, really is part of the story of why commercial operators are taking over, because they can just operate more efficiently, they're willing to cut prices to get that extra booking. But then the home share says, well, you know what, I used to be able to rent my room for 60, now it's 30, it's not worth my time. So again, it explains part of why if we had fewer of those commercial operators, we'd see more of the home sharing, which is certainly a lot, the impacts are not so bad. Yeah.
You said one of the major stumbling blocks for cities regulating Airbnbs is access to data.
Yeah.
And it seems like Airbnb should probably have a lot of data on their listings. Obviously, they don't want to share that with cities because they don't want to be regulated. They want to make more money. What tools are in cities' toolboxes to actually obtain that data? Are they able to do that?
Here's the toolbox, and it's totally empty. Unfortunately, this is there's a spectrum of ways that Airbnb will cooperate with city governments, and they will always cooperate on collecting and remitting taxes. Pretty much, you know, if you say let's collect a hotel tax, they'll do that, and they'll burn the company to the ground before they hand over that kind of data. They've been in court in a number of jurisdictions in the U.S. right now, fighting municipal attempts to get data, and they're settling where they absolutely have to. But it's a kicking and screaming kind of situation. I think that, and a lot of my thinking about good regulations for short-term rentals has been guided by watching those legal fights and realizing that cities need a plan that doesn't rely on getting that data or that cooperation from Airbnb, because they're not going to get it. You know, and they'll get some cooperation on some issues, but they'll never get that. So that's why, from my perspective, this mandatory host registration just kind of solves that problem. And I want to point out, by the way, that Vancouver is the city in Canada that's done the best job of that, with having registration. Everybody registers. It's working pretty well. It's not perfect, but it's working pretty well. But really, this is something for the provinces to be doing, because cities just don't have. You know, they like. No disrespect to the HRM. Like, I think you could do a registration system. It could work, but really, the province has the tools. They've got the control of the whole jurisdiction, so they can have one registration system. The cities can do what they want with the information. They have the tax records that make it a lot easier to establish the identities. So in my perfect world, we forget about the cooperation with Airbnb. I mean, take it where you can get it, but you're not going to get it. And instead, let's talk about registering all the hosts, letting the home sharers be sharing their homes, and focusing on the commercial operators for the housing impacts. Yeah.
Hi, I live in Schmidtville, which is a wonderful old neighborhood about a block away from here.
Yeah.
And we recently got Heritage Conservation District designation, so we get to maintain it that way. Wonderful thing about Schmidtville is, beside the fact that the houses are very expensive, is that the median income in 2017 for Schmidtville was $25,500 a year. That means half the people make more, half the people make less. So it is an affordable neighborhood.
Yeah.
A couple of months ago, in September, when we usually look out the window and see students moving in, we noticed there were no students moving in.
Right.
We do, however, see a lot of people with the wheelie cart. And the reason I worry about the increasing proliferation of short-term rentals is, one, is that it will no longer be affordable. That $25,500 will go out the window. And the second thing is that when I go up and down the streets, I say hi to people. Increasingly, I just go, huh, instead of hi. You know, I don't know them. I've met a couple of them, but you have to really make a point of saying, oh, you're visiting here, where are you from? So we're very, very worried. And of course, we got a hold of the people from the Hydrostone who are with the Neighbors Speak Up. But my point is that we're not going to solve this problem by me arguing with my neighbors and telling them they ought not to do this and this and that, and telling them they're greedy. That's not going to work.
That's right.
It has to be regulated so that everybody knows the rules and they're all enforced equally.
And it's a very good point. If you think about that, if your neighbor decided that they wanted to take the building and turn it into a slaughterhouse, because they ran the numbers, it's going to make a lot of money. but they can't do it, right? I mean, there are land use rules, there's a whole host of regulations which constrain what people can do with their property in the public interest. And there's an ongoing question about how far those rules should reach, and we don't want them to reach too far. We want people to be able to do what they want with their homes to a certain extent. But then a guiding principle about that is that the neighbor should have some say, that there's a set of uses which is really compatible with residential areas and others maybe not so much. And I think that what we're seeing is that short-term rentals are posing some of those questions, where you kind of need to be thinking about what those broader impacts are looking like. So I think the story you're telling is one that I think we hear kind of unfortunately quite a lot. Yeah.
In terms of short-term rentals in Atlantic Canada, I've read that we have the highest amount of seasonal short-term rentals.
That's right.
So like say like May to September.
Yeah.
So how does your data change in seasonal in relation to long-term?
Yeah, that's a good question. So one point about, yeah, right. So the idea here is that if you look at the whole country, Atlantic Canada has a very strongly seasonal pattern to short-term rental activity. Tons of it in the summer, not so much else otherwise in the year. And the rest of the country looks different. So it's not like kind of the situation where every place is special. It's more like there's one story in Atlantic Canada and one story in the rest of the country. That being said, Halifax has the least seasonality of Atlantic Canada, right? And so that's a general rule. The big cities, and I think it's kind of understandable. It's that there's a lot of summer tourists, but it's also true that people like me visiting throughout the year, and we need places to stay too. And, I'm in a hotel, but somebody else is in an Airbnb. So the bigger the city, the less seasonal that pattern is. One clear result of the seasonality of short-term rental activity here is that it probably is leading us to underestimate the housing loss, because the more seasonal the activity is, the more it's viable to mostly just kind of make your money in the summer. And then you hope that you make some more throughout the rest of the year maybe, but what it means is that we're looking for these patterns where we're seeing year-round activity to decide when we think we're really sure that this is a full-time short-term rental. And so my guess is that there are listings which are kind of slipping under our radar, because ultimately we're crunching gigantic spreadsheets, and as opposed to looking individually at each listing. So that would be one thing there. But I would say that on the whole, the seasonality story is not such a big issue when you're looking at the patterns in the city. What you do see though is in university towns is landlords who like to get the students out for the summer and bring in short-term rentals. And we were asked by the city of Montreal to look into this in the Montreal case. And what we found is that landlords were doing that. They would do 9-month leases and get the students out for the summer and Airbnb it. And they'd make a boatload of money. That it was really great for them. But and you'd think, okay, the students get to go home if they're from Toronto or something like that. They get to go home for Toronto for the summer. The students actually turn out to hate it, because it just creates so much, just one more level of kind of instability in their lives, where every year they have to find a new place to live, whether they want to or not. It also, the city ended up deciding that it was probably detrimental to the ability of the city to keep some of those graduates around, right? That you finish your degree, now you've got a bachelor's degree, you're ready to find a job, and maybe you'd like to stay here. And particularly if you're staying for the summer, that's the time when you're looking for a job. Now, if you're forced to leave on April 30th, well, probably you go home. And now you're looking for a job there. So, in the end, the city of Montreal had been lobbied by some of the landlords to make an exception for that seasonal pattern. And they said no thanks, because they didn't think it was in the interest of the city residents. Yeah.
So if you have more costs in the sense of regulation,
yeah,
normally costs are passed on to the consumer.
That's right.
Doesn't it just raise it kind of a...
So if there, yeah, so I mean, I think the short answer is yes. If there are more, if the effective cost of operating a short-term rental increases, then that cost will be passed on in some portion to the consumer, who is, a visitor, right? So I think that's a kind of, if I'm in the UN, being asked to designing the rules for the whole world or something like that, then that's a really serious question to think about, because you've got to think about the kind of welfare story. But I think from a local perspective, I don't know. I don't know. I think that if tourists want to visit and they have to pay an extra little bit of money to do so, that's not the craziest idea in the world.
And also the government has said they're looking into this.
Yeah.
Have they been in touch with you or?
Yep. Yeah. So we're having this conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah. But one other thing I'll point out on that point, by the way, is that I think in fact what would happen is if you got some of these commercial operators out in the market, what would happen is the prices for an Airbnb for a night would go up a little bit, but not much. They go up a little bit, and those people would be staying in somebody's home who's out of town for the weekend, who as the spare bedroom. So you'd see more of the market go to the home shares at a slightly higher price, I think. But we've never seen any research suggesting that tourism flows in general would be affected. You know, I think like 97% of the visits that happen through short-term rentals are happening even if those short-term rentals don't exist, is kind of roughly speaking what research has found on this. So that implies to me that there's a lot of room to maneuver. And again, just a couple of years ago, it was mostly home shares anyways, right? So it's not like we can't imagine that kind of world. No, that's 2017. I can imagine that just fine. So.
Question down here, David.
Okay.
Yeah, I was looking at the $30 million number.
Yeah.
And I looked today on the Nova Scotia Tourism website and discovered that what a tourist spends in Nova Scotia generally 16% on accommodation.
Yeah.
So that translates on the peninsula to $187 million direct tourist spend in our peninsula.
Yeah.
And the spin-offs is probably a $300 million
yeah.
upbeat thing for our economy. So I grew up here. I'm 60 years old now. When I graduated, probably 7/8 of my class moved to Toronto and Ottawa and Calgary. But now I'm starting to see the kids stay here. I like the impact on the economy.
Yeah. I
like the fact that the youth are getting jobs here. I like all the restaurants. This is the hottest I've ever seen this city. And the other thing about this thing is it's fun having people come from away and talk about our market. But Halifax is probably the oddest city in Canada. So there's about 70,000 people live on the peninsula. There are 15,000 students.
Yeah.
2/3 of which don't stay here for the summer. So there's a huge business opportunity if you just rent those student accommodations to tourists in the summer. Nobody loses. The economy gains, people get jobs, it improves our self-esteem. We don't have to be poor.
So I think you're making some good points. I want to push back a little bit on the first one. I think you're like, as far as the kind of back of the napkin goes, I think you're totally right that you've got 30 million accommodation spending, so that's like 180 or 200 or something, and then there's some multipliers. So you're talking about a lot of economic impact. But the way to assess that impact is to think about the kind of counterfactual situation where you don't have the short-term rentals, or where you have. And so first of all, I don't think that that's a realistic situation. I think when I'm talking about the kind of, the path that I'm suggesting is a path where you have the short-term rentals, you have them as home sharing, where the money goes into people's pockets, instead of you don't have larger landlords operating these. But even so, one way or the other, the idea is that there isn't any strong evidence suggesting that people are visiting because of short-term rentals, right? It's clearly there's evidence that people like short-term rentals when they visit. They're choosing to stay in them, right? But every attempt, and I'll be honest, there hasn't been a ton of this, so I think the error bars here are not tiny. But attempts to measure how much of the spending coming through Airbnb would not have come if people were forced to stay in hotels.
We measure that all the time. We've got an average of $4 billion in this province. We want to go from $2.2 billion to $4 billion in the next 4 or 5 years to support our economy.
Right. So
in rural parts of Nova Scotia, they couldn't do it without Airbnb.
So I think the rural parts of the province, it's a different story there, and I think I think that is a very reasonable point. In the city, I don't think that that's what the numbers show. I think that the economic impact is coming through Airbnb, and all that extra spending that isn't happening in the accommodation part would be coming the same way if people are staying in somebody's spare bedroom instead of in a ghost hostel. And I think that that's what the evidence shows on that. Yeah, no, that's what I do all day long, is look at those numbers. So I think on the second point though about the students, I think that's an interesting question for different places to be looking at about what that balance should look like. Again, when I've had this discussion I had in Charlottetown a couple weeks ago, and I think the story is kind of similar in terms of the proportion of their population, which is students in the area around the UPEI. And I've had that conversation very closely in the area of Montreal around McGill. And we've come to certain conclusions about that. It's possible that here that story looks a bit different. And I think these are very reasonable questions to be discussing as the kind of regulatory train starts rolling. What I'm trying to do is kind of start with this basis of here's what the numbers look like, and then I think you're absolutely right that it's a question for Halifax to hash out how they want to set that.
Just the final thing. I mean, I've got 3 children. I would like them to live here.
Yeah.
If they can't live on the peninsula and they have to go all the way up to Rockingham, I mean, that doesn't finish me off. They can still find a place to live here We've got the largest land mass in any city in Canada. We're.
But you also have a vacancy rate, which implies that people are really struggling to find homes. If you've got a 1.6% vacancy rate, I mean, that means that it's hard to find housing.
What's
So,
that in relation to the immigration, though? We have a really increased immigration as well.
Yeah.
Looking for the demand for those new homes.
right, well, this is part of but these
So
are
we need
these are
that
exactly.
data as well.
Yeah, and that data is out there. Like these are facts. Like what I would say is that when you look, if you want one number that says like what's the story on people's access to housing, particularly on the affordable end, you look at the vacancy rate. If you've got a high vacancy rate, that means people who want to find an apartment have an easy time doing it. And if you've got a low vacancy rate, it's the opposite. So Halifax right now has a very low vacancy rate. That means that on the face of it, people are struggling to find housing. And there are lots of reasons why they're struggling to find housing. One of them is that there needs to be more housing. I mean, that's the big one, right?
Yeah.
And the need for more housing is that's going to be answered in the long term, I hope, by major investments from the federal government, from the provincial government, in building a lot more housing, as well as from the private sector, right? But that's a story for 5 years from now, basically, because that's, it takes a long time to get that housing through the permitting process, through the development process. It's also true that right now you got 740 apartments in Halifax, which are hosting tourists. And they could be hosting local residents instead. So I consider that kind of low-hanging fruit there, as opposed to the longer-term story of we need more supply. But I think these are both part of the conversation, and that's exactly the kind of conversation we need to have, Frank.
Yeah, I was on the CMHC website today and had a look at some of their data. And they really sort of put the focus on, Halifax has been under great pressure. A lot of people are coming to Halifax and wanting to live here. And that's where they see that's where the pressure's coming from. And they talk about, there's gonna be 3,700 new, there's construction going on right now for 3,700 new units for Halifax, like this year. And it's increasing, and we can all see it, when we drive around the city. There's a lot going on. So, things will rebalance. And this sort of sessions wants to pin it all on STRs, but there's lots of factors.
There are lots of factors.
And it's
I
not
want to
fair
be clear
to just say it's this.
No, exactly. And I want to be very clear. I'm not trying to say it's just this. What I'm trying to say is that so multiple things have been happening at the same time. And one of these things is that Halifax, like some other cities, is increasing a lot of, there's increasing incomer, demand for living here, right? And the thing is, that's a great thing, right? Like that's cities thrive because they're growing, because there's lots of interest, there's lots of demand. These are all good things. It's problematic if the thing that is supposed to be the good news turns out to be not so good news because actually now nobody can find a place to live. Something else that's been happening at the same time is that short-term rentals are providing a really nice way to make money instead of renting to local residents. Normally what you'd expect when there is more demand for housing because people are coming and moving to the city is that you've got landlords saying, okay, great, well, here you go. Instead, coincidentally, basically, the same time as all these people are moving, you've got landlords being like, I make 3 times as much when it's an American visiting, so you can't blame them. That's what they're doing instead. These are both part of the same story about the difficulty with housing availability and affordability here. And I think you're going to be very disappointed if you expect that this is going to solve all those problems. But I also think that a lot of the solutions look like we need 5 years. We need a time for new supply to come online. And here we're just staring at hundreds and hundreds of homes, which are just there. So I think that these are both parts of that same story.
There's a couple of things, and some of them are already answered in the questions before, but I was thinking about what kind of statistics that you actually collect on the consumer. And I'll give an example because in Halifax, there are so many people, even coming into Halifax from an hour away, that need accommodation, even just for the evening.
Right.
The hotels are totally not affordable. Like you can pay $200 and some dollars, and they don't have it.
Yeah.
So now I'm noticing more and more people using the short-term rentals. It was because not only can they come in and stay even just for a night, they can bring the whole family and stay in that accommodation that they can't do and cannot afford in the regular hotel. So that's one thing. Is that, and also people on low incomes, I'm noticing, they have more options now for travel. Because before it was just hotels. Now they can say, oh, I'm gonna take my family away for the weekend or whatever to do that. So that's one thing. The other thing, it doesn't matter if you take these commercial businesses out of the picture or you don't. Those low income people, it's not about the house, because they can't afford the housing even when you do take it off the stream. So I think you're absolutely right. We need more affordable housing so that people actually have affordable places to live.
Yeah, and I think the first part of what you're saying about like new options for people visiting, I totally agree. I think that's a great thing. You know, I think like home sharing is opening up a lot of choices for people visiting. Another one that I think is quite common is that people who have medical needs, where you know there's a hospital stay, right? You're living out of the city, and there's somebody who needs is going to be in the hospital for a month. That's a huge crisis for the family.